Tēnā koutou katoa, ka nui te mihi ki a koutou. I'm very pleased to be here for this auspicious kaupapa. Ko ai au, he uri tēnei no Ngāti Parau, Ngāti Raukawa me Ngāti Kahungunu, no te araroa tōku karaua, ko te whānaua hinerupe, te whānaua tūwhakairi o ngā hapū, ko ahuriri ko Jerry ngā whānau. No Ruahāpia tōku kuia, ko Ngāti Hāwea te hapū, ko Paku, ko Pānapa ngā whānau, ko Annabelle ahuriri Driscoll tōku ingoa. I've learned two things from the healers that I've been fortunate to spend time with. Tuatahi, Wairua puts you in places. If you find yourself somewhere, it's because you're meant to be there. And tuarua, be clear about who you are in relation to the given kaupapa. My research in relation to rongoa is what's brought me here today, but my connection to the kaupapa is also personal. My great-great-grandfather, Henare Kawakawa mai tāwhiti pōtai ahuriri, was a practitioner of rongoa rākau, and according to my koro, contributed some content to Murdoch Riley's book. He was also a deeply spiritual man, a ringatu, and my koro has fond memories of his lengthy karakia and the power of that karakia. I've entitled my kōrero, The Future of Rongoa Māori is Here, as a reference to some of our initial mahi that I'm going to talk about, which we are nearly 15 years down the track from. Some of the things that were envisaged by healers then have come to pass, and some are still unfolding. So the theme we're gathering around is collaboration to support positive health outcomes for whānau and hapori Māori. This has arguably always been the kaupapa of rongoa, and it will continue to be, although the landscape has changed and is changing considerably. I'm going to share some insights from the 3 research projects that I've had the privilege to be involved with, each collaborative efforts of healers and researchers to explore and address the marginal position of rongoa. And at this point I must acknowledge Maui Hudson, who in his interactions with Hohepa Delamere had been inspired to explore the potential through our mahi at ESR to support rongoa. And that resulted in 3 funded projects which explored different aspects of the same kaupapa, and that kaupapa being the return of rongoa to its rightful place as, in the words of Nanny Olive Bullock, Aotearoa's original health intervention. And so Maui instigated conversations with the Ministry of Health and ACC, which resulted in our first piece of funded research, which explored the contribution of rongoa to Māori wellbeing and outlined a vision and some of the issues for the sustainability of healing practice. On the basis of that mahi, Maui led a successful bid to the Health Research Council for research that would document the wellness outcomes pursued by healers in their practice with patients. And Isaac Bashara was a central part of that project. And in the final project, Maui and I worked with Amohia Bolton and Heather Gifford from Whakauai Research to secure further funding to identify service arrangements that would best support and uphold rongoa practice. And so each project involved healers from different rohe and communities and would not have been possible without their belief and buy-in. So I'm going to talk through each piece of research in terms of its processes as well as its outcomes, what the nature of each collaboration was, and how they moved us further forward towards the sustainability of rongoa. So our first project was a partnership with Ngā Ringa Whakahaere o Tiwi Māori, then led by Mark Ross. And we held a number of hui and wānanga around the motu with healers, but also health stakeholders. And so some of the questions we asked centred around current practice and service delivery, relationships with the health sector, the credibility of healing, issues around transmission, and what future research might focus on. And so our findings with respect to the contribution of rongoa to Māori wellbeing were, of course, that contribution is comprehensive and multi-level. Obviously, the health benefits that the assessment processes, treatment modalities offer clients and patients. But then for Māori, There's that added personal and cultural acknowledgement, the validation of us as people, as well as our whakapapa, whānau, our beliefs and our values. We know in terms of practice, in terms of whareoranga, there's employment and vocational opportunities associated with rongoa service development, and of course, the empowerment and the strength through retention and revitalisation of mātauranga, tikanga and te reo Māori. But two key concerns emerged with respect to the sustainability of rongoa. The first being the sustainability of environmental resources that supply the rongoa, and that necessitating a level of environmental well-being. And here are some quotes to this effect from workshop participants, stakeholders and healers. You know, the deep interrelationship between the land and the people recognised, and rongoa being at that interface. Sustainability also applies to the practice of rongoa Māori in terms of retaining knowledge, validating the practice and ensuring its ongoing use. And this particular quote came from a workshop in Taumaranui, a participant lamenting the loss of rongoa, you know, talking about the period in which there was some embarrassment for those things Māori, and who lamenting the fact that rongoa was one of those taonga that we left behind, I guess, in that period of forced assimilation. And that kōrero about sustaining rongoa in this regard, the mātauranga, the practice, extended beyond health to patent rights and intellectual property. So really big concerns for healers. We identified two different perspectives regarding how rongoa might be sustained or integrated, and we talked about this being a practice or service distinction. The notion of service and practice was the perspective held largely by healers, where values placed on serving the people, aroha ki te tangata, and the broader kaupapa through the practice of rongoa. The notion of practice and service was the perspective held primarily by health and other stakeholders who weren't necessarily healers, and the idea of rongoa practice being enhanced perhaps into professional scopes of practice through being included in services. So clearly both perspectives serve to seek to support rongoa, but in quite different ways. It was generally accepted that the practice of traditional Māori healing would continue regardless of institutional support, as its practitioners respond to a calling and commonly have a gift for that mahi. But many healers want to be recognised for the work they do and its contribution to health, and so stakeholders saw that as possible through service development and research. But the question is how to realise that vision of Indigenous medicine sitting alongside Western medicine with equal recognition, which was shared by stakeholders and healers alike. And so this diagram really just elaborates on that distinction, showing the contrast between a traditional vocation practiced in specific rohe, passed down through generations and within cultural frameworks and processes, and a service based on formal standards, funding streams, professionalisation, contracting for outcomes. And so while service-focused development might be a key strategy for extending the reach and the impact of rongoa, it's essential that this doesn't happen at the expense of the practice or the art of rongoa. And indeed, quality rongoa service provision relies on robust practice applied effectively by practitioners working from a strong cultural base. And so healers in this mahi commented that rongoa practitioner competency and credibility couldn't be decided, or shouldn't be decided, only according to formal certification, but granted via iwi and Māori community mandate. So what really came through in a pathway towards self-determination, the integration of rongoa within publicly funded services being a significant step. It gives, as we've heard today, gives Māori wider service delivery choice, culturally appropriate care that's consistent with our values and worldviews, that nurtures our identity, has the potential to improve Māori access to healthcare, reducing some of those barriers associated with appropriateness and appeal. But, major concerns raised by healers and others about the implications of that integration, potentially subjecting a traditional practice to Western scientific or medical criteria. And so the first quote illustrates this concern. Do we want to subject our taonga to these criteria, measures or boxes? And we've heard from Jonathan this morning that no, that's reassuringly not the path that he and Glenys and Donna have taken. But this idea of we potentially trying to fit a circle into a square. And then also, I guess, some of the contradictions inherent in this position that we find ourselves in. We want to have our cake and eat it too. So, we want to be recognised and we want to drive it. And so this tension around how can you own it and be accepted by the mainstream. So in our second project, Moi Milne and Mari Stewart provided valuable guidance as research team members. And so based on that previous work, our starting point was that rongoa Māori has significant value, it delivers health and many other benefits to its recipients. So we wanted to create something of a shared language or a way of describing or articulating those benefits in a way that could be understood and supported by third parties such as funders. We needed to know, in order to develop a set of rongoa wellness measures, what are the outcomes that healers work towards for their clients? And so we conducted interviews with key informants employed within organisations that fund or are potential funders of rongoa services, but the bulk of what we did was to hui with healers across the motu to ensure that what developed was locally, broadly relevant, but connected to those key healer networks such as Ngā Ringa Whakahaere and Te Paipai Matua mō te rongoa. From there we had a smaller working group to establish a group that would commit to working consistently and closely with the research team in the development of those measures. And that was an open group. It allowed people to tap in, tap out as they were available, and they could determine the extent of their contribution. So that's an important research learning. And then in the second phase, we trialled those outcome measures or frameworks that we developed in the first stage with 4 case study whare oranga. And so this is the wellness framework that resulted. As a whole, it provides some insight into the logic and the thinking that healers draw upon to inform their interventions. The intervention logic, if we want to use that term, underlying the practice of traditional Māori healing, drawing on Māori philosophy and thinking. The application of Māori values and local or rongoa tikanga reflects the significance and the importance, the criticality of that local diversity and mana, both in the understanding of the wellness domains and the stages of intervention. And then the intervention axis is based on healers' kōrero about the stages of healing activity along the tūroro's pathway to wellness. So assessment determines what needs to be done in terms of clearing and balancing the person. Dealing with symptoms provides a foundation for strengthening and enhancing the tūroro's wellness. Promoting healthy lifestyles, part of this holistic approach to oranga, the prevention of future illness, the tūroro's self-care and rangatiratanga, and that being the ultimate goal. The right-hand column represents various ora that contribute to or make up total wellness, forms of well-being related to each of those domains of wairua, taiao, whānau, hine, ngaro and tinana. The ones that are on the left-hand side of the column, left-hand column. And so those domains, I guess, are presented in order of their relative fundamentality to healing. And then we've got some essence statements or definitions of those ora moving beyond the well-understood tinana and hinengaro domains to the less tangible domain of wairua. And so various states of illness or wellness were plotted according to where they sit in each domain and their location on a general illness-wellness continuum, filling in that sort of emerging grid. In a version for use by healers, those boxes were left blank for healers to plot and record client issues and then revisit or add to them over time. So we were able to describe healing as it relates to wellness from the point of view of the healers that we were working with, their beliefs and processes. And the visual on the right-hand side is just a segment of a flowscape that Zach Bashara utilised in one of our hui. So we were able to identify some primary outcomes central to healing practice, this notion, and we've heard it today from Pa McGowan, balance, understanding or enlightenment, and self-determination. So in addition to that wellness framework, we also developed a whai ora tool to assist healers and tūroro to identify wellness aspirations as therapeutic goals and to document whether or not these were met in the course of healing consultations. And so overall, this provided a means of recording rongoa effectiveness for tūroro. So these tools, the framework and the tool, were trialled by several whareoranga to determine whether they were actually useful, usable in practice, in conjunction with the assessment and recording procedures that healers already had. And so a number of whareoranga found that they were useful. They helped debriefing following consultations. They promoted a more collaborative, systematic and comprehensive reflection or assessment, and also supported that continuity of care. There was also some recognised teaching or professional development value, and some talked about the supporting kaimahi paper training, building a resource for kaimahi to consult mātauranga rongoa. And another whareoranga said actually it's really useful for emerging whareoranga to develop their own practice models from. But the research also provided valuable insights about how, as researchers, we could best collaborate with healers in translational spaces. And we've talked about this, we've named this Indigenous Spiritual Inquiry. And so there were two instances of this that we had the privilege of being part of. The starting point of both was observation and experience. In the first instance, those of us in the research team were party to a collective wairua healing that healers agreed to conduct for a hui attendee. And so in that collective healing, they were each drawing on their individual healing strengths to sense or assess and address the tūroro's need. In the second, we were recipients of a whakawātea process undertaken to eliminate mental, spiritual, or energy blockages prior to our hui. And so that clearing process was undertaken primarily by one healer who sensed and removed blockages with her hands without physical contact. And while she did this, other healers observed and instructed her on progress, whether the healing was sufficient or needed to be continued. So this whakawātea was felt in terms of physical effects in the first instance. For my colleague, a relief of physical discomfort. For me, a sensation of energy leading to temporary heart flutters. And so that healing was accompanied by a personal message or a piece of advice for each of us related to what the healers had sensed. So following that, all of the debriefs after those experiences were healer-led. In the first instance, we discussed what had happened in the healing collectively. And then with input from research team members, so Zach with his flowscape, that debrief or reflection evolved into a structured research activity where key components of rongoa were abstracted from those first and second-hand accounts of healing practice. So this was very much linked. This focused on the link of healers to a spiritual and collective consciousness and those collective healing energies. In contrast to that first instance, the second was a bit more individually and internally focused. And so we had a hui following that whakawātea, led by another healer who asked our group, our rōpū, to share our insights and our soul connection to the kaupapa. And so this required us to engage at a different level, at a very personal and deep level. We each located ourselves in relation to the kaupapa rongoa and shared that with others. So I found that really helpful, really powerful for combining this direct first-hand experience of healing with talk about it and generating some important personal and professional insights. So weaving those experiences and insights through our research was very fruitful. It built trust, learning between healers and ourselves. I think it gave each of us confidence in the contribution that research can make to the kaupapa. The novel forms of spiritual inquiry helped us to shift in our collective understanding, which then helped the research to continue to move forward. We were encouraged as researchers to relinquish control of the kaupapa, to strengthen our ability to listen and to engage fully, genuinely and authentically with healers. So I think how healing was modelled within the Ngā Tohu o Te Ora research, as deemed necessary by healers themselves, it tells us something about the centrality of Wairua. And actually, when we're doing research in this space, the need for methods that can account for that dimension more fully and explicitly, or bringing the Wairua back, according to one of the karaua involved. For healers, the spiritual alignment or the tika of the research, first and foremost, is a form of quality assurance. Get that right, all is right from thereafter. So one of the key tensions that emerged in this project was related to evidence, and we've seen evidence come up several times in the kōrero this morning. We came to understand that it's essential that rongoa interventions are not undermined through evaluation outside of their natural context. So we moved well away from that notion of standardised, objective measurement of disease or wellness states, or trying to measure wairua and mauri in a research sense. We moved toward healer and patient reported outcomes, so either goals that had been met or improvements that had been noted. We also focused instead on healers' evaluation of usefulness and usability based on how they adopted and adapted the tools that we developed. But most importantly, this research provided a directive for the amendment and the expansion of understandings relating to what constitutes evidence, rather than the other way around. As a taonga tuku iho, knowledge and practice passed down through generations, rongoa has been empirically verified, established as culturally right, consistent and effective. The understandings of what works and what's appropriate derive from healers' practical application of their healing knowledge, which might involve experimentation, innovation, the development of techniques and skills. This practice-based evidence might be accorded greater validity than it currently is. Healers were not averse to, and actually were quite enthusiastic about, evidence-based practice, but I think that might indeed be an endpoint. But I think what this highlights is that our journey towards that endpoint might be an altogether different one. And there are also important implications for future research, particularly if we want to influence health policy and contracting. Verifying the contribution of rongoa practice to health gain is perceived by healers and stakeholders alike as a pragmatic, safe way of securing wider support for rongoa and services. But we are faced by a prevailing paradigm of health outcome measurement based on standardisation, control, uniformity and fragmentation. And that is incompatible with the complexity, dynamism, holism and the diversity of traditional healing practice. But this prevailing paradigm it's still has significant purchase with decision makers. So that points, from a research perspective, that points to the need for us to continue our resistance on the Māori health methodology front, to continue Māori health research action to ensure that our taonga tuku iho are not lost in translation. So, coming to the third and final project, that was based around the service practice distinction from our first piece of work. And we did this work in 3 discrete phases. In the first phase, 13 interviews with health policy and decision makers, funders and fund holders, managers of rongoa services, as well as sector advocates. And then in phase 2, we undertook a national survey of healers, which yielded a 79% response rate. In phase 3, we conducted case studies with 3 practices. At the point that we began this project, Ngā Rangawhakahaere o Tiwi Māori had merged with Te Paipai Matua to form Te Kahui Rongoa Trust. And the focus of Te Kahui Rongoa in developing healer-led tikanga standards at the regional level meant that some of our proposed aims were now less relevant. For example, our first aim to identify key principles for rongoa practice. So that was a case of healers and healing practice being ahead of the research, which is entirely appropriate. But today I'm going to focus primarily on the survey of the healers that we undertook, and that was with 7 of the Te Kahui Rongoa rohe. So those working within the 7 rohe were predominantly female, 68% of all workers and nearly 3/4 of identified practitioners, and also Māori, so 56%. The largest concentration of practitioners were in that 50 to 59, 60, 69 year age groups. In 2 rohe, however, there was a good representation of those in the 30 to 39 and 40 to 49 age groups. Just over a third of those working within respondent practices described themselves as tohunga or principal healers. Just under 2/3 were 50 years and older and were female. But women were also more likely to work in supporting positions, comprising 3/4 of kaimahi, kaiawhina, kaiwhakahaere and whānau assistants. Only a very small proportion, 6%, were paid employees, most reported being paid from forms of work other than rongoa, and no principal healers were paid employees. In terms of workforce sustainability then, there are some critical questions. With an ageing rongoa workforce, what succession planning is happening, and is it happening in a way that can support the transmission of mātauranga to the levels and the extent required? And what are the challenges for principal healers in terms of carrying the burden of keeping rongoa alive with minimal financial support or funding? There were also some interesting findings relating to healing modalities and practice. And so while variance is to be expected based on healer attributes and skills, as well as the environment or the context in which they're practicing, rongoa rākau was less common than might be expected, offered by just under 2/3 of practices who responded to our survey. And some of the lowest reports, again, I mean, this is how people have completed a survey, but the lowest reported rates were in Tairāwhiti and Taranaki. So concerns about the supply of rākau and the impact of contractual constraints around rākau collection and preparation might be being borne out in changes to practice. Just under half of practices reported utilising matakite. So these snippets of the survey data reflect that ongoing dichotomy of practice and service with respect to rongoa, and they leave us with an enduring question. Do we work within and around the dichotomy, or are there alternatives? So key supports for rongoa into the future identified by our research participants were support from iwi. This theme featured throughout our research, and there was an understanding that iwi do have other settlement, post-settlement priorities, and the labelling of rongoa as hauora might see it viewed as a Crown responsibility. However, participants felt that rongoa would sit and should sit really well within a cultural revitalisation focus. It's worthy of preservation, similar to other taonga such as Reo Mahinga Kai. There was also the sense that greater support by iwi would enable some of the limitations of engaging with non-Māori or Crown entities, such as being subject to non-Māori frameworks, might be able to be bypassed. Increased integration within the health sector, obviously pretty key focus here, and healers expressed interest in going beyond Ministry of Health to pursue regional-based funding with DHBs, perceiving that there might be some possibility for increased flexibility there. It was recognised then, though, that this would require rongoa practitioners to have a stronger regional profile, and this is arguably being achieved through Te Kahui Rongoa. There was also recognition of, as we've heard, the opportunities presented in primary care, also in, tertiary care, to support practitioners and clinicians working together to provide seamless care. We've got these imperatives of patient-centred care, comprehensive care plans, and maybe some creativity around funding mechanisms. And our care informants also recommended other actions listed there on the slide, including some significant issues carried over from the previous projects. And lastly, despite the constraints, healers and stakeholders realised the value of the Crown accepting its responsibilities for actively protecting rongoa, including more substantive direct funding and mitigation of threats. Some action on the environmental degradation, negativity associated with Māori knowledge. And so healers talked about, that is what we need to see to enact genuine Te Tiriti partnership. Late last year, Te Aka Whaiora developed a Rongoa Māori action plan, of which each of its directions align with the issues that we heard from healers and stakeholders in our rangahau. The importance of increased investment, supporting and growing the workforce, increasing awareness and understanding of rongoa Māori, as well as more system-specific responses, a partnership approach to rongoa commissioning, strengthen system coordination for rongoa. So, over the period that we were engaged in this research and beyond, there have been considerable changes and some notable achievements. There has been progress towards rangatiratanga, a move from ministry-derived standards to healer-driven standards. In terms of research developments, there are those such as Glenys Marks and Donna Kerridge who bring both research skill and rongoa healing expertise together, so leading rongoa research in exciting new directions. And this is important because research will continue to be an important tool to serve the kaupapa of rongoa as both a practice and a service. This conference is a milestone in terms of public recognition and awareness of rongoa and its value. However, the true benefit of these achievements will only be realised in a society that values Māori people, knowledge and culture, and accords due respect to Te Tiriti o Waitangi. As noted by legal historian David Williams in Y262, no system of cultural knowledge can flourish in a climate of fear and ill will. And that speaks not only to the long shadow cast by the Tohunga Suppression Act and other oppressive historical actions, but the climate that we find ourselves in now. Engari, rongoa has survived, and there has been a building of momentum and energy in terms of its revitalisation. Me haere tonu tātou. So I want to acknowledge the following individuals and organisations who supported our research, particularly those healers who continue their mahi for the benefit of us all. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, kia ora hui wi mai tātou.
Tēnā.